For more than 2 years, the Kremlin's objective has remained the same: subjugate Kyiv. Inconsistency in support from Ukraine's international partners, caused mostly by political delays, has left the door to this outcome wide open. However, with the recent approval of a long-delayed $61 billion U.S. military aid package, Ukraine's outnumbered troops are going to get a much-needed boost in their battle against Russia's invading forces, that are now nearly 500,000 strong. This new round of funding will certainly help, but the fact remains this has already been a long, difficult war, and another $61 billion isn't going to guarantee a Ukrainian victory, not even close. If Ukraine and its allies want to prevent a Russian victory, they're going to need a more comprehensive strategy, one that includes training, equipping, and mobilizing new forces, a strategy bold enough to convince Putin that continuing this war will be more costly to Russia than anyone else. It's safe to say, though, that few of the decision-makers in Kyiv or Washington are betting on Putin having a change of heart. But still, after facing a number of setbacks this winter, Ukraine's ability to fend off advancing Russian forces remains in question. Really, this war is turning out to be more of a race against time for Ukraine, as its military runs low on ammunition and artillery, as Russia continues to intensify its attacks and gain ground. Nothing is certain at this point, but Ukraine would have certainly remained on its back heels were it not for the approval of its new aid package. Without a significant shift in strategy, though, continued support from the West might only serve to extend the duration of the war, yet have little impact on its ultimate outcome. Before clearing the Senate with a bipartisan vote of 79 to 18, this most recent aid package bill struggled through the U.S. House of Representatives, but ended up passing with a supermajority of 311 to 112, although the majority of Republican representatives voted against it. In response, Democratic Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said that with the passing of this bill, America sends a message to the entire world: we will not turn our back on you. This was also welcome news to President Zelensky, who said it reinforces America's role as a beacon of democracy and a leader of the free world. President Zelensky, as well as many of Ukraine's other military leaders, has stated plainly that without more money from its allies, Ukraine faces a very real prospect of defeat. Still, though, there are plenty of others who are not as optimistic as Schumer or Zelensky, claiming that the money won't make a difference, and it might even make things worse. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova reportedly stated that if the U.S. doesn't back off, the situation in Ukraine will likely turn into a loud and humiliating fiasco, much like Vietnam or Afghanistan. Zakharova also claimed that for its own reasons, the U.S. wants Ukraine to keep on fighting a war of attrition, all the way down to its last man, woman, and child. Before the vote, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov also said that by accepting monetary aid from the U.S., Ukraine has put itself in a position where it's not only fighting to provide profit for the U.S., but now also must fight the last Ukrainian because of its debt. The favorite colonial policy of the United States of America, he said. Peskov also said that the outcome of the vote was expected at the Kremlin and that it won't change the situation on the battlefield in any significant way, and that the money being provided will only result in more Ukrainians being killed. Former prominent members of Ukraine's armed forces have also been skeptical of the aid package, stating that the weapons it'll bring might improve the situation along the now 1,000-kilometer front line, but that it also feels like a symbolic handout, simply a way for the U.S. to show the world that it hasn't forgotten about its friends. The weaponry, equipment, resources, and munitions in this package, however, are anything but symbolic, along with a fresh supply of anti-tank guided missiles and 155mm artillery shells, hopefully enough to satisfy the outgunned Ukrainian military's desperate hunger for more shells. This package also provides a range of ballistic missiles, armored vehicles, and air defense munitions. To truly put Russia on the defensive, though, and potentially win the war, Ukraine is going to need longer-range missiles with advanced warheads, like the ATACMS, a precision-guided missile with a range of up to 300 kilometers, as well as more advanced air defense capabilities and maybe even a few F-16s. But these are unlikely to come in the earlier shipments at least. The package limitations, some experts have claimed, were designed to give Ukraine just enough support to keep it on the defensive without giving it the reach necessary to launch a meaningful counterattack and regain some of its lost territory. Otherwise, the U.S. would have given them more tanks, the 31 M1A1s they received early last year not being nearly enough. Since the beginning of the invasion, the U.S. has committed $175 billion to Ukraine's defense. This new round of funding will produce an immediate surge in deliveries of military equipment, which had fallen to roughly 10% of last year's numbers. Because of the delay, another funding package likely won't be needed until January 2025, conveniently after the U.S. presidential election. But even as we continue to break down the details of the package and what it will mean in the short term, the question still remains, can Ukraine win this war? So far, Russia has amassed nearly 470,000 troops in Ukraine, with the intention of establishing complete control of the Donbas by the end of this year. Focusing their attacks on various key eastern towns, the Russian army hopes to gain a strong enough foothold to seriously threaten Ukraine's main logistics hubs in and around the Donetsk region. After more than 2 years of war, however, Russia's army has a severely depleted officer corps, which has seriously limited its ability to plan and carry out large-scale attacks. Most of its recent attacks have consisted of successive assaults by platoons or companies, resulting in slow advances gained only through heavy losses. And if Russia moves forward with its impending summer offensive, this coming influx of U.S. weapons and ammunition is only going to drive up the cost it's already been paying. For this newest round of funding, even if it won't guarantee victory, it will give the Ukrainian forces enough material to support a more systematic defense for the summer and fall. This most recent aid package, officially titled the Ukraine Security Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2024, will be distributed across 6 primary categories, with the largest allocation, $25.7 billion, being designated for military weaponry and equipment. The lion's share will be used to 1. Maintain domestic stockpiles by replacing U.S. equipment and munitions that have been or will be sent to Ukraine. 2. Enable Ukraine to purchase American weapons and munitions through the State Department's Foreign Military Financing Program. And 3. Enhance U.S. defense industry production capabilities and weapons development, which will hopefully allow the U.S. Army to meet its monthly production goal of 100,000 155mm shells by 2025. Currently, the U.S. produces around 40,000 of those shells per month. Ukraine, however, will need at least 100,000 per month if it plans to maintain a formidable defense. Another $17 billion of the aid package will go to funding the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, a U.S. Department of Defense-led funding program designed to increase Ukraine's capacity to defend itself by providing 1. The Ukrainian military with the training it might need for new weapons, 2. The U.S. with funding to buy arms on the global market, such as Soviet standard equipment that Ukraine forces are accustomed to using, and 3. Provide Kyiv with funds to purchase weapons and equipment directly from U.S. manufacturers. Part of that $17 billion will also go to various other U.S. intelligence operations. Another $7.9 billion will go directly to the Ukrainian government to provide support for essential government services, including law enforcement. In response to intense pressure from Republicans and former President Trump, this portion of the bill was structured as a loan, not a grant. But when the time comes to pay up, the acting president can still forgive the loans unless Congress takes specific action to intervene. Another $7.3 billion will go toward increasing the U.S. military's presence in Europe, while $2.5 billion will go to humanitarian aid programs, including a Special Assistance for Europe, Eurasia, and Central Asia Fund, $481 million to support Ukrainian refugees living in the U.S., $300 million for counter-drug activities, and $100 million for demining operations. The final $355 million will go to other U.S. governmental agencies, including $150 million to the Department of Energy's non-proliferation activities, a long-running effort to minimize nuclear incidents. And nearly a third of this, $98 million, will go to fund research for medical devices, a worthwhile effort but not necessarily related to the war in Ukraine. Except for the humanitarian aid portion of the bill, the final approved version closely resembles what President Biden requested last October. However, along with Ukraine's nearly $61 billion, the bill also includes $26 billion for Israel and $8 billion to advance security measures in the Indo-Pacific region. The Israel supplement specifically allocates $9.2 billion for international disaster assistance, migration and refugee assistance, and international narcotics control and law enforcement, a significant portion of which will also go toward managing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. With the addition of these other provisions that will directly benefit Israel and Taiwan, the U.S. seems to be sending a clear message to Iran and China. That is, don't even think about it. The bill also comes with a number of new sanctions aimed at Russia, Iran, and China, and also includes provisions that will likely result in the nationwide ban of the popular social media app TikTok. And with all this money going out, the U.S. has also been looking for ways to earn some back. Another provision of the bill allows for the liquidation of confiscated Russian assets, of which there is about $327 billion worth, with most of the profits going straight into Ukraine's defense fund. With that said, however, even the phrasing aid to Ukraine can be misleading. The financial support they'll soon be getting won't arrive in Kyiv as pallets of cash. In fact, the vast majority of the money going to support the war effort in Ukraine will be spent in the U.S., given that most of the weapons being sent over were produced in U.S. factories. The salaries paid to the government employees and U.S. service members helping out are also mostly spent at home. Even a portion of the humanitarian aid funds will re-enter the U.S. economy. In the end, most of the money, including what will go to the Ukrainian government, will be handled by the World Bank. But even with President Biden's signature on the bill, it's still going to take some time for even the most needed shipments of munitions, like the 155mm howitzer shells, to reach the front lines and hopefully deter Russia's advance. And for Ukraine's badly outgunned and thinly spread frontline troops, as well as President Zelensky, who recently claimed the ratio on the battlefield had reached 10-1 in Russia's favor, these shipments can't come soon enough. In the past, it's taken weeks, even months, for the equipment to reach the hands of Ukrainian soldiers. But this time, President Biden said that some shipments began moving just a few hours after the bill was signed, with the earliest deliveries likely including items that can be shipped quickly and make the biggest impact: artillery and air defense munitions, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, for example. Depending on the system and where it's coming from, time of delivery can vary significantly, but drawdowns from U.S. stockpiles will typically reach the front lines the quickest. For example, the U.S. has plenty of cluster munitions to spare, so when the Biden administration agreed to send some of those over last year, they arrived in less than a week. Other equipment, however, like the first few Abrams battle tanks, took nearly 8 months to arrive in Ukraine, largely because of the time needed to refurbish the tanks and train the crews. The new weapons package will include Patriot interceptor missiles, as well as National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System interceptors, counter-drone systems, and significant amounts of artillery ammunition and air-to-ground missiles. But most of this will be ordered from U.S. manufacturers, not drawn from existing U.S. stockpiles, meaning it could take years for some of those weapons to show up on the battlefield in Ukraine. Other shipments, however, though this information hasn't been confirmed by American officials, appear to be waiting at pre-positioned storage facilities in Germany and Poland, which will obviously cut down on delivery time. Once across the border, it'll be up to military planners in Kyiv to get the shipments as quickly as they can to where they're needed the most, a huge logistical challenge given the massive quantities of material being moved. But the Russians know this too, so to complicate distribution, they're likely to shift the focus of their attacks to Ukraine's transportation networks. According to the Institute for the Study of War, a nonpartisan, nonprofit, public policy research organization committed to improving the nation's ability to execute military operations, Moscow deployed a similar tactic earlier this year, intensifying its missile and drone attacks on Ukraine's energy grid, which led to critical shortages of ammunition and supplies. The assault failed to wipe out Ukraine's power grid, but several critical failures in multiple different cities were destroyed. And it seems likely that Putin will continue using strikes on Ukraine's transportation infrastructure to exploit the delay of Western aid, impede logistical operations, and disrupt frontline communication. In the coming weeks, Ukraine will likely continue to face shortages of artillery ammunition and air defense munitions, limiting their ability to mount an effective defense. A crucial element of this first shipment, however, won't need to travel far to give Ukraine a serious advantage, and may even turn the tide of the war. On top of everything else, Ukraine will also likely be receiving the much-desired longer-range ATACMS, or Army Tactical Missile Systems, that have a range of around 300 kilometers and can be fired from the wheeled M142 High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, a mobile rocket launcher commonly known as HIMARS, that Ukrainian forces are already familiar with. The U.S. already provided Ukraine with the shorter-range versions of the ATACMS, which have proven to be highly effective in a number of cases, including during a pair of synchronized nighttime attacks in October 2023 against two military airfields, one in Berdyansk and the other in the Luhansk region, a dual strike that resulted in significant losses on the Russian side, including 9 military helicopters, an anti-aircraft missile battery, and an ammunition storage depot. According to the Pentagon, however, a few long-range ATACMS were already quietly included in the $300 million aid package announced earlier this year, and it ultimately was delivered to Ukraine in April. For quite some time, the Biden administration resisted sending long-range ATACMS to Ukraine, partially due to the unpredictability of Putin's response, but also because of America's own readiness concerns. These powerful missiles require time and complex components to produce, and Lockheed Martin, the aerospace company that manufactures them, at full production capacity, can only crank out about 500 per year. Most variants of these 4-meter-long missiles carry a WDU-18 230-kilogram blast fragmentation warhead. They can travel in excess of Mach 3, around 3,700 kilometers per hour, and depending on which variant you choose, they can cost between $820,000 and $1.7 million a piece. The impressive speed of the ATACMS compared to similar cruise missiles, such as the UK's Storm Shadow or Russia's Kh-101, has been one of the key selling points, and is due largely to the fact that the ATACMS is essentially a ballistic missile with a rocket engine strapped on its back, which also makes them very hard to shoot out of the sky. Although it could take some time, finally getting a steady supply of the longer-range ATACMS variants will allow Ukrainian forces to launch attacks further into Russian-held territory, including the Crimean Peninsula and other areas bordering the Black Sea, increasing their ability to hit the Russian airfields, fuel depots, and weapon storage sites, which will ideally decrease Moscow's ability to continue what has largely turned into a war of attrition, one that it seems to be winning. But Ukraine, now flush with cash, will likely be doing some serious recruiting. Unlike Russia, which can more easily replace the men it casually sacrifices, Ukraine is struggling with unit depletion and replenishment. Some think the patriotic motivation that once swept the country is running out, while other experts have said that Ukraine doesn't appear to be facing a shortage of potential troops at all. Some analysis suggests that there could be several million Ukrainians eligible for military service, and that Ukraine's troop shortage problem stems mostly from recruitment and training failures, as well as an inability to provide the necessary equipment for new soldiers. As recruitment hopefully ramps up, Ukrainian military leaders will also need to focus on forming a new series of brigades, rather than trying to replenish the existing ones. Right now, there aren't enough brigades to allow for full rotations away from the front lines. Instead, battle-weary battalions are rotated just off the front for short breaks. This does offer them some rest, but it doesn't allow them any battalion-level training or familiarization of the new equipment. For now, though, lacking the necessary numbers and equipment to launch a meaningful counterattack, Ukraine will likely continue to settle for maximizing Russia's losses with each new position it takes. And we won't have to wait long to see how this plan holds up, because the next target on Putin's map appears to be Chasiv Yar, a small town in the Donetsk Oblast, with a pre-war population of just 12,250, which has been considered the next likely target for Russia's advance since the fall of Bakhmut, about 10 kilometers to the east. The battle for Chasiv Yar has in fact already begun. After being held just outside of the ruins of Bakhmut for nearly a year, Russian forces have gained some ground, moving through the fields and forests until they reach the outskirts of the town. At that same time, another flanking assault has slowly been pushing up from occupied Avdiivka, intending to cut the supply road from Kramatorsk to Kostiantynivka, a larger town on the Kryvyi Torets River that developed during the Soviet era into a major industrial center, but has more recently served as an important staging ground for Ukrainian military. Sources in Kyiv have claimed that over 20,000 Russian troops have gathered for the offensive that Putin hopes will win the city. This doesn't look good for Ukraine, but a successful defense of Chasiv Yar, which will rely heavily on the newly arriving Western aid, is an absolute top priority, as the city is largely considered the gateway to the four other cities, Kostiantynivka, Druzhkivka, and Kramatorsk to the south and southeast, and Slovyansk to the northeast, which form the backbone of Ukraine's defense of the entire Donetsk Oblast. But even as shipments of much-needed artillery and ammunition make their way to Chasiv Yar, it remains unclear how capable Ukraine's forces will be in terms of mounting a formidable defense. Even as conditions improve, many brigades have been hollowed out by delayed defensive preparations and long periods at the front without rotation, while Russia has only upped the pace of its attacks, looking to maximize the territorial gains it's achieved by taking Bakhmut and Avdiivka. During the early stages of the battle for Chasiv Yar, it seems that both sides are leaning heavily on what's been commonly referred to as drone warfare. Chinese commercial drones are being used to maintain constant surveillance, while first-person view, or FPV drones, are being used for one-way kamikaze missions against enemy equipment and personnel, but also to drop grenades or other custom-made munitions, allowing them to be used again. So far, around 90% of Ukrainian casualties in Chasiv Yar have been from drone-delivered munitions, according to some of Ukraine's frontline medical units. Not only has this surge of drone attacks changed the nature of the wounds they're treating, but it also made evacuating the wounded incredibly more dangerous. This phase of the war has been dominated by the sight lines and ranges of FPV drones, which means that even armored vehicles can't guarantee safe evacuation. Most transport vehicles, especially high-value targets like Humvees, are now fitted with electronic warfare kits, used to disrupt or intercept enemy communications, targeting, and radar signals. But drones aren't the only unconventional weapon that's shown up on the battlefield in Ukraine. The U.S. State Department has also formally accused Russia of using chemical weapons against Ukrainian troops, a violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. In response, Washington placed a range of new sanctions on at least 3 Russian government entities linked to the country's chemical and biological weapons programs and 4 Russian companies that contributed to them. This announcement came as part of a group of nearly 300 new sanctions placed on companies and figures in multiple countries as a result of their support for Russia's war in Ukraine. Among them were China, Azerbaijan, Belgium, Slovakia, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates. Since the beginning, Ukrainian troops have claimed that they've been targeted with gas and other chemical irritants on the battlefield, including chloropicrin, which was widely used during World War I but is no longer authorized for military use and is now mostly used in agriculture, according to the Centers for Disease Control. Though there's been no evidence of chemical weapons being used in Chasiv Yar, not yet anyway, Ukraine remains in a very tough spot. For now, its defense of Chasiv Yar remains stable, with little to no confirmed territorial gains in the area outside the city in early May or late April. But the same cannot be said further south, where a botched rotation near the town of Ocheretino, northwest of occupied Avdiivka, created a growing bulge in the front line. To take Ocheretino, the Russian forces likely found unmined routes along the railway, allowing them to launch a sudden attack as Ukraine's 115th Brigade was being rotated into the area to replace the exhausted and diminished elements of the 47th. This has opened up a number of tactical opportunities for the Russians to widen the breach. Lacking the necessary manpower as they face simultaneous offensives in multiple locations, it becomes nearly impossible for the Ukrainian military to deploy reserves to reinforce a specific area. So whenever Russia gains ground in one direction, it creates an immense pressure on the fronts elsewhere, as Ukrainian troops try to defend multiple areas with limited troops. Though they've kept the Russians from breaking through, Ukrainian units are having a very hard time on this part of the front. There are many reasons for this, including shortages of ammunition, supplies, personnel, and in some units, training, experience, and organization. Some have also complained about a lack of sufficient support and clear planning from the general staff and the government. But if Chasiv Yar does fall into the hands of Russians, the Russian army will have gained a commanding position from which to further utilize drone attacks and so-called glide bombs, easily striking key Donbas towns, collapsing buildings, driving out local populations, and seriously compromising Ukrainian supply routes. And to make matters worse, the more Ukraine is forced to use its surface-to-air missile systems to protect its cities, the less it'll be able to support its ground forces on the front. The use of glide bombs, which are mostly Soviet-designed FAB-500s that have been outfitted with wings and guidance kits and can be launched by Russian aircraft from behind their own lines, emerged during the battle for Avdiivka. Basically, it's a 450-kilogram bomb launched from aircraft that can fly nearly 65 kilometers and destroy targets that might be considered impregnable otherwise. By maximizing this option, Russia can significantly reduce its human cost per square kilometer gained. The endless positional fighting that's largely been the theme of this war has led to the depletion of both Russia and Ukraine's already overstretched forces, so it's no surprise we're seeing creative alternatives. Throughout this war, both sides have been experiencing unsustainable losses, a horrific level of carnage that's been witnessed most notably in places like Bakhmut and more recently Avdiivka, and neither side can afford a repeat in Chasiv Yar. The battle for Bakhmut, a city located on the Bakhmutka River about 90 kilometers north of Donetsk, kicked off in early August 2022 after the Russian forces advanced from the city of Popasna, following a Ukrainian withdrawal there. What took place after that has not only been considered the bloodiest and longest battle of this war, it's also been called one of the bloodiest infantry-on-infantry brawls since World War II. The main assault force consisted primarily of pro-Russian mercenaries from the controversial paramilitary organization known as PMC Wagner, or the Wagner Group, who were supported by some regular Russian troops and elements from the Donetsk People's Republic. By November, attacks on the city had intensified, as Wagner fighters were reinforced by units coming from the Kherson front and the newly mobilized recruits. By this time, too, much of the front line had descended into staggering trench warfare, with both sides paying a huge price for every meter gained. Only by sending waves of former convicts straight into Ukrainian lines was Putin able to gradually end the stalemate. And by February 2023, Russian forces had captured key territory in both the north and south of Bakhmut, nearly encircling the city. Ukraine's forces had no choice but to slowly withdraw, which resulted in weeks of fierce urban combat. A month later, Russian forces had captured the eastern half of the city, up to the Bakhmutka River, and were continuing their advance into other Ukrainian-controlled areas. and by the end of May, the Kremlin was claiming they had full control of the now pulverized city. After 8 months of heavy fighting, in a city with a pre-war population of approximately 72,000, only 4,000 residents remained, mostly living in underground shelters with no access to water, gas, or electricity. Once a popular tourist destination, known for its sparkling wine produced in underground caves, its broad tree-lined avenues, lush parks, and late 19th century mansions, Bakhmut was reduced to a smoldering wasteland. Even as he denied Putin's assertion that he'd captured the city, Zelensky compared the visible devastation of Bakhmut to Hiroshima after it was hit by the atomic bomb. Despite the fierce struggle to control it, initially Bakhmut was not regarded as a target of great tactical importance, but it would ultimately become one of the central battles of the Russo-Ukrainian War so far. Similar to what occurred later in Avdiivka, as the battle raged on, the city itself gained a new level of symbolic importance to both sides, largely because of the heavy investment of manpower and resources it was taking to claim it. For both the Ukrainian and Russian militaries, the Battle of Bakhmut has been described as a meat grinder, some of the fiercest urban combat in Europe since World War II. The intensity of fighting and the number of casualties has even led some experts to compare Bakhmut to the Battle of Verdun during World War I, where hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing during the nearly year-long struggle between the dwindling armies of France and Germany. In the end, the best Ukraine could hope for in Bakhmut was to keep the Russians bogged down as they depleted both their resources and morale. But as their own ammunition and supplies ran low, hung up by political infighting back in Washington, Ukraine's forces lost their strategic edge. Supply lines were disrupted, and casualties surged. In the last days before Russia announced its possession of the city, Ukrainian fighting positions had been whittled down to just a handful of crumbling buildings. Outnumbered and outgunned, pinned down by constant bombardments, the Ukrainians continued to be hit by waves of mercenaries. When their defensive positions finally gave way, however, and a tactical retreat was ordered, it was too late. The delayed retreat would ultimately compromise Ukraine's advantage and result in scores of unnecessary casualties. These heavy losses would damage the reputation of certain generals who were harshly compared to Russian leaders known to be careless with the lives of their troops. This misstep would also eat away at the Ukrainian public's trust, dampening their already waning enthusiasm for voluntary military service. Still, Ukraine's losses were a fraction of Russia's. According to the head of PMC Wagner, the mercenary group lost over 20,000 soldiers over the course of the nearly year-long battle, while another 60,000 were injured. But other experts believe those estimates are probably low, by a few thousand men at least. The battle for Avdiivka followed a similar pattern. By the time the demolished city fell into the hands of the Russians, only a few of the city's 30,000 pre-war inhabitants were left. Ukraine's 110th Mechanized Brigade, which had been stationed in Avdiivka since the war began, held the line as long as they could, but when the last of the 110th withdrew from the city, the fears of Ukraine's leaders as well as many experts were realized. For 4 straight months, as the violence in Avdiivka reached its apex, the troops of the 110th demonstrated remarkable resilience, fending off a seemingly inexhaustible enemy with the help of the Ukrainian Army's 47th and 53rd Brigades, who'd been guarding their flank with drones, mines, artillery, and even a few American-made M2 fighting vehicles. The 110th inflicted tens of thousands of casualties on a Russian force that was once 40,000 strong. After months of what resembled trench warfare more than urban combat, Avdiivka was ultimately transformed into a ghost town, with its few remaining residents, perhaps 1,000 people, mostly living below ground, relying solely on humanitarian aid for survival. But in the end, as the last of the 110th began falling back to the west of the city, the remaining residents were all escorted out. Throughout this war, but certainly in Avdiivka, we've seen an odd mix of modern warfighting capabilities, drones, modern battle tanks, precision-guided missiles, etc., and knockdown drag-out battles for terrain that are reminiscent of World War I, where 100 meters, 1,000 meters, are gained here and lost there, while an outrageous number of casualties pile up on the battlefield. We've seen these outdated tactics being used by both sides, but especially Russia. Since Ukraine launched its failed counteroffensive back in June 2023, Russia has attempted very few larger assaults. Since then, a relatively predictable pattern has emerged. Given that neither side has held the capacity to launch the sort of massive attack that would result in large gains on the battlefield, we've mostly seen smaller units pushing ahead as far as they can, typically with a lot of artillery and drone support. After more than a year and a half of intermittent fighting, though, Russia finally launched its first full-scale offensive aimed at encircling and capturing Avdiivka. And it worked, even though they suffered huge losses on the battlefield. In the first few days of their offensive, Russian forces were able to capture roughly 4.5 square kilometers of territory around the besieged city. Then, after thousands of Russian soldiers had been ravaged by artillery fire, Ukrainian troops noticed a change in their tactics. They began to divide up into smaller and smaller formations, making each unit a somewhat less obvious target for Ukrainian shells. While at that same time, Russian airstrikes hammered the city's defenses. Ukraine's outnumbered forces also took a beating from Russia's artillery, as well as hundreds of gliding bombs. An unconfirmed source from the Ukrainian military command claimed that, at last count, in the region of Avdiivka between January 1st and February 15, 2023, their inflicted casualties mounted to 20,018 personnel, 199 tanks, and 481 armored combat vehicles. That's a lot of damage for only 6 weeks of fighting. But Ukraine has suffered its fair share of casualties too, and not just during those final days in Avdiivka. President Zelensky has claimed that some 31,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died in this war so far, but most Western analysts say that number is significantly higher. And this latest delay in military aid hasn't helped. It'll take precious time to repair Ukraine's diminished capabilities, meaning it'll likely lose more ground to Russia this summer, perhaps even Chasiv Yar. The question now is how much ground, and how high a price will Ukraine make Russia pay for it? For Russia does not have an unlimited supply of men or material. Based on the current rate of loss, Russia will be out of armored vehicles by the second half of 2025, meaning Russian troops will be entirely dependent on newly produced equipment. At the same time, however, beginning in late 2024, the production of European weapons will begin to climb. As investments made last year and in the first months of this year begin to pay off, this means that by 2025, problems of supply should be far better for Ukraine, but far worse for Russia, if the Ukrainians can hold on until then. However small, there's also the chance that this war ends diplomatically. But for the moment, Ukraine doesn't have enough firepower to push for terms that would end the war in its favor. Ultimately, a, quote, successful end to the war will likely depend on NATO's ability to intimidate Russia. But this will require both a sufficient number of coalition forces to counter a Russian threat and a rate of munitions production that can sustain a steady flow of ammo in the event of another war. But really, establishing the supply of munitions will be necessary, regardless of how the war ends. This new aid package was passed just in time to keep Ukraine on its feet. But to truly shift the direction of the war, a far more comprehensive strategy is needed, and soon. Because perhaps the one asset Ukraine has the least of right now is time. But what do you think? Will this latest $61 billion boost be enough to halt Russia's advance? Is the US just wasting its taxpayers' money? What would it take for Ukraine to win this war? Can either side afford a repeat of Bakhmut or Avdiivka? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button.